everybody, this is Morgan J. Ingram, host of the SDR Chronicles. I'm super excited because today I have my boss, Director of Sales Development, Lucas Ulloque. I'm actually super fired up that he's on this show because he's going to bring it. He may even have more energy than me. We'll see. So what we're going to talk about today is diversity in tech. Him being Hispanic, me being African American, something we want to take a deep dive into. So I'm going to let Lucas further introduce himself, and then we're going to go on the topic of the day.
Awesome. Super excited to be here, Morgan. Been watching this thing take off, and I've been begging to get on the show. So Morgan finally made some time for me. So excited to be on the show. My background, I graduated from the University of Georgia back in 2011. I went to Salesforce.com, was on 3 different inside sales and sales development teams there, and led those teams from a team lead perspective. And then came here, Sangram grabbed me from Salesforce and said, hey, come build this thing here. Got Morgan J, and this thing is taking off here. So excited to be on the show.
Yeah, definitely. So let's dive into the question. So what do you believe is the current situation with diversity in tech, and what makes you feel so strongly about it?
Yeah, so obviously coming from one of the biggest software companies in the world to a small startup where I was the 18th employee, what I've noticed is there's just a gap, right, in terms of demographics and diversity. At first, I didn't know why, and now, I've been interviewing and hiring more reps. What I realize is it comes down to exposure, right? I think a lot of people from diverse backgrounds that maybe didn't have family that was in the tech world, or knew of friends that were in this space, just don't know about it, right? And there isn't a major in college that you can go to be an SDR, right? So I think there's so much opportunity for people of diverse backgrounds in this type of work. I just think it's getting that megaphone to those schools, right? To those, to those HBCUs, to those Latino communities, and getting the word out there.
Yeah, so, women, minorities, all kind of fall in this bucket of, hey, maybe they're not represented enough. So, why is that? What's happening there?
Yeah, so, we were at AAISP last week in Chicago, and I sat in on a few sessions specifically around, finding women specifically for SDR roles. And what I realize is that a lot of recruiters in tech companies are looking in the wrong place, right? They're looking at, maybe we'll find someone that came from another SDR role, another tech community, or another tech company. What we need to start doing is looking in other backgrounds, right? Like education, so teachers, right? Hospitality, retail, different backgrounds and disciplines that people have, obviously interacted with other people, have great communication skills, interpersonal skills, and just don't know about this type of work, but would thrive in this type of collaborative setting. And we've brought on some folks like that recently, and they've been excellent, communications backgrounds, people who've worked in television, right? A lot of those have been very successful for us, but it's just pointing the laser in the right area. I think that's such a big thing, right? If you're only looking in one small pond, you're going to see the same fish, right? So it's kind of expanding your horizons, looking at some maybe non-traditional backgrounds. We have 2 guys that came from insurance, right? From State Farm, and they've crushed it, right? So it's changing the perception of where you need to come from to get here.
Yeah, and I love how you brought up multitudes of diversity. Not only is it's gender, race, and even different backgrounds. It's not just that traditional, hey, you've been in tech, you were at Salesforce, you're at Marketo, come over here. It's more so hey, you're insurance, you were here, you just came out of college, and I think that's an important conversation. So how do you proactively find those people? Because I know they're not just coming to you, you gotta know it, right? So how do you do that?
So the key is you gotta go and make it happen, right? So, something you and I say, you can't leave your faith, especially if you're a hiring manager for an SDR team. You can't rely on a recruiter to go and make it happen, right? You got to go and find these people. So part of it is, making a presence at local colleges and universities, going to HBCUs, connecting with different people on LinkedIn, asking other people in different regions in different parts of the country, how they're attracting this type of talent. And it's really you putting yourself out there, right? You can't go and expect someone to do it for you, a recruiter to be oh, I'm going to find you, I'm going to find you one person in each of these demographic buckets. It's no, you go and make it happen. And that's kind of what we've done, and, kind of challenged ourselves to be our own recruiting team, right? And self-source most of our own hires.
Mm-hmm. And then when you're finding these different individuals, what's the number one skill they're looking for? Because obviously there's no background in tech, right?
Yeah.
So like, what's the number one thing that like, okay, I see it, like they can be successful with this one skill?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for me, it's intrinsic motivation, right? And curiosity. Right. If you're motivated, we can create a motivating environment around you to have you reach your full potential, right? And you have to be curious, right? You have to want to know, I want to learn everything I can about this business in a 3 to 5 minute call, right? So I may not get the meeting, I may not get the demo, but when I hang up, I want that person to be like, gosh, I wish our salespeople were that knowledgeable or that curious, right? So you got to have that, right? And I think that curiosity, is an intangible, right? We can't teach you to be curious, right? We can, you can give an SDR, stock discovery questions and have them go down that list, but there's something to a person that's inside of them, their internal fiber, that's like, I really want to learn about this, right? And I want to understand the lingo, and I want to understand how these companies are aligned and how their KPIs are measured and all of those different things. And that just comes with the person.
Yeah. And I think that's super critical because, as you're interviewing, Lucas has done more interviews than than I've ever seen in my life. But I think, of course, as you pick that up, you're seeing that people who are intrinsically motivated, those are the people who overall are going to be the most driven, because like it doesn't matter like what they run up against, they're going to go through that wall.
Yeah, I agree. I think those types of folks, they're going to keep pushing to get better, right? Those are the types of folks that when, maybe in their first month when they're not ramping as fast as they are going to spend more time on the weekends, listening to podcasts, listening to, calls that you have from a conversation report. Those are the folks that are going to make it happen, right? And then those are the types of folks that are going to be on that relentless pursuit of constant feedback. I think that's such a good sign when you see reps coming to you and it's like, hey, push me, I want to keep getting better, right? Like they're pulling calls and sending them to their managers ahead of the managers pulling them themselves, right? It's like they have that fire that's like, I want to be great, right? And when you have someone like that, you can mold them and coach them, especially if they come from a non-traditional background, because there's no bad habits, right? It's like you're working with a blank slate, and that's exciting to get to work with people like that.
Yeah, 100%. And so we talked about, podcasts, you talked about like learning outside of work. So these are things obviously that you're going to have to do if you're already behind the 8 ball, if you are coming from a diverse background. So, how do you like implement that for somebody? I know that you said it's an inner drive, but like, is that something that you almost have to have because you are coming from a diverse background and maybe you're not the same as everyone else?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So what we've done now, and is when a new hire starts, prior to day one, we send them a ton of collateral and things to read, things to listen to, stuff like the SDR Chronicles, things like our SDR call bank, different things for them to listen to kind of get their baseline of what their knowledge is on our space, on what we do, even up before they even come in on day one. So the other thing too is in your 90-day new hire ramping or training model, including those different segments, right? Having them listen to different things, maybe from outside of your organization. Something we've done is, send some different podcasts from different sites to our team, right? And a lot of times it's not on like, how do you schedule demos, but it's on other things like, keeping a steady mindset that you talk about a lot, right? Putting sticky notes on people's desks to, on their computers to stay positive. So I think if they come in and already have, 2 weeks of prep before they even come in on day one, now you've got someone with a non-traditional background that's already, a week into their training. Because they've already learned so much before they've come in.
Yeah. So, that's coming from, of course, a leadership standpoint and helping other people. So, personally, for yourself, like, when you came in, it's like, okay, obviously, coming from a Hispanic background, never been in tech, like, that disadvantage, like, how did you come in and be like, how am I going to succeed? Like, what was your thought process and how did you do it?
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? So, when I started my first team, I kind of remember, like, I walked in that first day and I was kind of like, my eyes got all big. I was like, holy cow, there's, like, dashboards everywhere. So I said, let me start examining these dashboards. Let me see kind of who's at the top of the game, right? And then what I did was it was really easy to see who was a top performer.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, all right, Lucas, you're going to sit with this person every day for at least an hour or 2 hours and just learn everything they know, right? And it's like, and teach me everything you know, right? And kind of show some vulnerability, like, hey, I've been looking, at your numbers, and I see that you're absolutely destroying the game. Like, I want to be able to get to that level. Like, how do you do that, right? And people are going to appreciate that, right? That little, that vulnerability, and then was asking them all these questions and being genuinely curious, right? Like, why do you do that, right? Like, why do you log your calls, like that, or why is your workflow like this? And then it was mixing that type of knowledge with my work ethic, right? The other thing too, there weren't any other Hispanics that were in the role either, right? So, for me, I came in with a chip on my shoulder that was like, hey, maybe, I don't have the most impressive, tech resume, but I'm going to come in here, I'm going to put in the work, right? And I think there's no substitute for that. So I mixed, people that were doing really, really well, I mixed all of their insight with my work ethic, and then I continued to come back. It wasn't just like a one-time sit with. I kept coming back to them, and then I started bringing in other people and other pieces to the team and meeting with them. And then my goal was to try to take a little bit from everybody and make my own style. And then I knew if I could, outwork my peers and put in the time and do it the right way, that I was going to be successful.
So I love that, right? And that's kind of the same thing that I did. I came in and I think Lucas was like, he needs to stop asking questions, because I asked so many questions, because I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. So because what you did is what I feel like every single person should do. So my question to you is like, why doesn't every single person do what you do? Is it because they feel like they're already at an advantage? And do you feel like you're at an advantage because you were at a disadvantage?
Yeah, so I think people come in and they start feeling like they understand what they're doing, and it's like their human nature to kind of let off the gas a little bit, like, oh, I set my first demo on the phone, like, I got this, right? Instead of being like, I set my first, how do I send 10 more this week, So people, it's like when people hit quota, you have two types of people, right? You have people that are like, this is just the beginning of my month, and I'm going to keep, grinding through this month and getting to accelerators, or like, hey, I'm good for the month. Like, I hit my number, like, I'm set, right? So I think for me, I always had that like chip on my shoulder and like that bird on my shoulder that was like, hey, I bet you won't make one more call. Bet you won't set one more meeting. And that kind of stuff psychologically to myself, fueled me, right? Like, it kept pushing me to like keep going harder, to keep making calls. Because, for me, it was like, you're only one more email, one more call away. Why would you let off the gas? And for me too, it's like I realized that like in a huge company like that, if you're mediocre, you just kind of blend in. You don't really, you don't. It's not like you're gonna, stick out from the pack. It was like I got to put in the work to be able to be on par with people who have 6 months of a head start on me. People who have been doing this a lot longer, to catch up to them and eventually, get to their level. Yeah,
for sure. And then for other, kind of getting back to a leadership standpoint on diversity. So, of course, there's a lot of SDRs, SDR leaders, sales leaders, tech leaders watching this show. So what's kind of your advice on like, hey, we want to be able to have a diverse background across the board. Like, what is your advice to them as you've been building the team?
Yeah. It's going to take work, right? You genuinely have to want to do it, right? So, Morgan and I have met with some African-American students that came up from Florida State. We prioritize it, right? There's a lot of things that are going on, in a day-to-day, especially on an SDR leader's calendar, but it's got to be a focal point of your efforts, right? So you got to make time for it, just like you make time to break down calls with your reps, just like you make time to look through the dashboards to see conversion percentages. You got to make time for it and make it a priority, right? And I think it's finding someone else and a team of people around you who are also bought into it, right? Like, you can't do it by yourself, right? It's so Morgan and I, obviously this is very near and dear to our hearts, and we're hitting it from different angles, right? You're going after the HBCUs, I'm going after the Latino community. We're going after we're going to bring in our STRs, our female STRs, to come speak to all women that are interested in tech roles. So it's leveraging the team that you have, but really being passionate about it and not letting up, right? Like, once you find your first, diverse hire, it's not like, all right, we've made it, right? it's continuing that grind and pushing and not letting up on it, to be honest.
Yeah, and then why is this so important? Why is this so important?
Yeah, so for me, it's one, we live in Atlanta, right?
Right.
And Atlanta's such a multinational city, and it's so diverse. Um, it's not fair to have a team that is all looks and feels and sounds the same, right?
Right.
And to me, when you have a team of really diverse people and you have a melting pot, that's when you really are going to see like the full potential of your team, right? Like you're going to have different ideas, different perspectives, different ways about doing things, right? And you're going to have people that are going to grow, right? They're going to learn from each other professionally, culturally, and I think like for me, it's like what I want is when you look at our team, it's like everything under the sun, right? I think of when I did orientation at Georgia and I was an orientation leader, like if you looked at our team photo, it was everything. It was white, African American, Asian, Hispanic. It was everything, men, women. So any student that came to Georgia for orientation knew that there was someone like them.
Right,
and that's
somewhere.
So important, right?
Yeah.
That there's someone that looks like me. There's someone that's been there, done that. There's someone that's going to care enough to invest the time to mold me and mentor me and educate me. So that's why it's so important to me,
Yeah, and to even go further into that, because you talked about, there's someone like them. Do you feel like at the end of the day, like that's why people are not aware as they could be? Because, in high school, I talk about this all the time, middle school, high school, college. I didn't even know that this job existed. So, it's like, what the heck? Why is it a phantom job? So do you just believe that, hey, because there isn't maybe someone like them or like that other individual that you don't have that accessibility into it? Do you feel like that's why it's not, not that big of a topic or maybe even that major to act upon?
Yeah, 100%. So I think people look up to people in their community, right? So when, you have role models, right? In your community, that's something you look up to, right? So if there's not someone that looks like you that's in a job or in an industry, you're probably like, well, that's not for me, or I don't know about it, or it's not worth my time. So it's something for us that it's like, what I pride ourselves on is like we find people who are really, really talented and we teach them how to become SDRs. Yeah. We don't find great SDRs on day one. We find people who are intrinsically motivated, who have great curiosity, tremendous grit, and then we bring them in here and then we invest in them and we pour into them and we coach them because we can teach them how to have conversations around account-based marketing, but we can't teach those intangibles, right? That desire to be great, that intrinsic motivation. But it ultimately comes down to exposure, right? And I think that's so much of like, that's on us to provide that exposure to these diverse communities
for sure,
to get them to understand like, holy cow, this is a great career.
Yeah. And did you have, Salesforce even now, external mentors that you kind of reached out to if you couldn't find that internal mentor? Maybe that would give you that advice.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I didn't have any like specifically Hispanic mentors.
Right.
But I definitely had mentors and people in my family that were like, there's a reason why you're doing this, right? And it's you're going to be able to, tell this story and be able to find other people that look like us, right? That, maybe we're Cuban kids in Miami that had no idea that there was a world in technology, you know, and that's what I think is kind of cool is like, how do we go and like find those kids and get them excited to come here, right?
Yeah.
And maybe they don't come to Terminus, which is fine, but they're going to land at another software company, in tech, and I think have a great career, and that they're just going to be like, hey, like, thank you, right, for that exposure.
Yeah, for sure, and that's also super important. And then also, let's just talk about mentors in general. Like, how important is that for someone coming from a diverse background? Like that. I feel like that's super critical at the end of the day because you don't really know anything. So, like, how important is that?
Huge, right? I think someone that you can talk to, and that mentor, even if you start as an SDR and you don't really know anybody, that mentor could be your manager, right? Yeah. That mentor could be, someone in the office that's, of the same background as you, but maybe on a different team, right? It's really, finding someone that believes in you, right? That wants to. That's the other thing too, right? It's like these mentors have to want to do this, right? And finding someone that's gonna be able to, spend time and coach you and help develop you and really be a sounding board for you. And I think that comes to the SDR too, right? And having good judgment and being able to pick someone that aligns with your interests and skill sets and backgrounds. But I think it's so important, right? Because you're going to be learning so much in the role, especially your first 6 months. You're going to be drinking from a fire hose, but then you want to have a mentor that you can talk to outside of work, even if it's a manager that you meet with, after hours, or and bounce some ideas off of. So I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah, and then how important is that, at least for a peer-to-peer standpoint, right? So you join a team, like how is it important to be cooperative if you're coming from a diverse background?
Huge, right? I think obviously you want the team to want to work with you, right? So I think it's being someone that's going to be a great team player, right? A great teammate. What we do is we give every SDR that starts an onboarding buddy, and this person's literally like their big brother or big sister on the team, right? They also are given an AE mentor later into their tenure. So we try to create a support system around every single person, and then make sure that there isn't just like, hey, you're good, now you're on the phones, now we're on to the next one. But it's like, hey, let's go back on your personal and professional goals. Like, where are you feeling insecure in your process? Like, be honest with me, because if you're not honest as to what you think is wrong in your workflow, by the time we find it, it's going to be a little later.
Late. It's going to be too late.
Right. It's going to be too late, right? You're going to have missed your number, and now you're going to be under, a lot more pressure that's unnecessary.
Yeah, and then because we talked about the chip on the shoulder and actually using that in a good way, but I think that even sometimes having a chip on the shoulder could actually turn into a bad situation. Because the question I just asked you was, is it important to be cooperative with your team? Yes.
Yeah.
How do you help someone who has such a chip on their shoulder that they actually are not cooperative, but they have a really huge inner drive? Like, how do you talk to that individual?
Yeah. So some of these people, you gotta tell them, listen, like, you don't know everything here, right? Like, you've come from a world where you've been very comfortable. Like, you're gonna have to challenge yourself to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So part of that is, if they're very like headstrong, they're like, hey, like, I'm not gonna be very cooperative. It's having them realize how much they don't know, right? Yeah. So when you're coaching them and you're breaking down calls and emails, and they're missing the value prop, and they're misarticulating how we help customers, having them see for themselves, like, holy cow, I have a big gap in terms of where my business acumen is. And then just being really real with them, like, listen, like, I want you to get really good really fast, but for that to happen, you gotta cooperate, right? Like, you have to kind of put your ego to the side and put your guard down, and like, my whole job is to get you to a place you can't get yourself. Right. Now, if you don't cooperate, like, that's not gonna happen, right? So ultimately, like, your whole job is to develop reps, right? Exactly. And if they don't cooperate, it makes it really tough. But it's kind of having that kind of heart to heart with them. It's like, listen, like, I'm here for you, right? Like, if you don't help me help you, then like you're trying to carry this backpack by yourself for no reason. Yeah. And I feel like that, that doesn't make sense, because obviously if you're carrying a backpack for no reason, you're going to fall over, and then it just doesn't work, right? Like, that's not what you want. So I think that's also super important. And I think even people from diverse and different backgrounds, it's going to be a mountain that you're going to have to climb, right? There's just, when I first started, when I was just told, like, hey, you're going to call and email people and you're going to get a meeting, I was like, this is the easiest job in the world. Like, I don't understand how this can be difficult. But you find out that it is super difficult because there's other people doing your job. You find out there's these other tools that I had no idea about. I had no idea what Eloqua was or Marketo. I was like, what is that? Like, what are you talking about? So I think it's important. You have to come into this role with humility, because you really actually don't know anything. But you learn at such a fast rate that you become that person who's very proficient. Yeah, and I think you're a great example of that, right? It was always wanting to know more, right? So, like, don't just coach me one time and then say, hey, we'll connect again on next one-on-one. It's like, hey, I'm going to make calls for an hour. You want to sit with me? And that comes down to, like, that genuine desire to be great, right? And when you have a manager that's sitting with you for an hour, that manager's now even more invested, right? Like, and for me, like, I saw the fire that you had, and that got me more fired up, right? That was like, I want this person to ramp in a month instead of 2.5 months, right? I want Morgan to be able to get to a point where people are like, man, how long have you been in the role? Like, you sound like you've been here 1.5 years already.
Right. Yeah.
So I think people can feel who genuinely cares and who really wants to be really great. And it's going to take a lot of humility, like you said, and then just asking for feedback, right? Continuing to ask for feedback outside of one-on-one. Something we do is real-time coaching, right? We hear someone on the phone, bam, break it down right away.
Right.
Because it's fresh in their mind, right? A week later, you may have forgot what the scenario was. You may not even know what this call is that we're going to break down. But making it real and then saying, hey, listen, like, this objection that you couldn't overcome, like, let's not trip again on that one, right? Like, let's make sure this is one that, like, you feel comfortable answering at any time. And that's how you're going to get good, because in this role, you're only going to get a certain amount of objections, right? Depending on what industry you're in. But the idea is that if you can learn all those objections really, really fast, and you can, put in a lot of activity and a lot of work, you're going to have a lot of conversations. You're going to have a lot of calls to break down. So yeah, I mean, I love it.
And I know that you're fired up, but how do you, the two biggest things from you, right? So how do you control what you can control? And then how do you stay humble?
Yeah, so it's something we talk about a lot, right?
Yeah.
Controlling what you can control. So you can't control if someone answers the phone, but what you can control is your attitude every day, right? Being positive, being someone that's, an energy, megaphone to your teammates, right? And then your effort, right? Your attitude and your effort, right? So putting in the dials during peak call times, being tight with your process and your cadence and following up when you're supposed to follow up, and that attitude and effort are the things you can control.
Right.
And then what was the second part?
The second part is, how do you remain humble? Because I know we have the stay humble, like on the
board.
Don't be smug. So kind of you can dive into that.
Yeah. So I think it's always realizing, like, at the end of the day, like, you're not curing cancer, right? Like, what we're doing is not, life or death, right? So, like, people that have that, start doing well and start getting an ego, part of that on our team kind of self-regulates itself because people will check each other
real quick.
But I think it's understanding that, like, listen, like, your job is to help companies, right? And to help customers see value in what it is that you're offering. And that's it, right? Like, do not get too big of a head or an ego because of that. And I think it's your managers should be able to, in a one-on-one, be able to, have specific examples of when you were smug or, you did something that was basically a little too showy, right? Because, and I think too, that's a culture thing too, right? Like, you're either going to have a team that nobody really does that, or a team where, like, you have a majority of your reps that kind of fit that kind of bravado.
And we've built that core foundation where, like, if you, like, it's actually, like, real. Like, if you are being too smug, like, you get called out immediately. The whole team calls you out. So
and then they don't do it again.
And then you don't do it again because you're like, I don't want to get called out. So as we kind of wind down, lasting questions, where do you see in 5 years the trajectory of kind of diversity in tech, and, like, where would you like to see it?
Yeah, so I mean, I've seen it just in the last 5 months, right here. I see it growing right now with LinkedIn and all of these social media outlets. There's more access to information than there's ever been, right? I think students are now at least being like, oh, I've heard of these giant software companies, right? Like, what do they do, right? So I think now the name recognition is out there. People know that there's, they have Glassdoor. They can start seeing some of the salaries that these folks make, and kind of the recruitment videos. So I think you're going to see a big wave of diversity. Companies, making strategic initiatives around diversity. But I'm wary of that, because if a company just does that just because it's like, hey, we need diverse people, then once they get them, it's like, all right, now what, right? It's got to be something that's in your DNA as a company to, hey, we want to find the best talent that's out there, and we want that talent to be a melting pot of talent.
Right.
But I do see it growing tremendously.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, we talked about it earlier in the conversation, the onboarding process, the DNA, the awareness. So that's really key. And so lasting question for you, Lucas, you just provided a lot of insight here.
Yeah.
What is the number one piece of advice that you have the SDRs as they enter into their new role?
Yeah. So one is to build your brand, right? Like, especially if you're at a high growth startup or company, like your team is going to grow, and everything that you do is indicative of your brand, right? So the work that you put into Salesforce or into your CRM, your notes, right? The AEs are listening to your calls that you're sending over, right? Are you someone that's really driving urgency, teeing up account executives? Are you someone that's just throwing every conversation you get over the fence and hoping that it turns into a qualified meeting? So building your brand is huge, and that's also externally, right? Like having people understand that, like, you represent the company and you represent the brand, so make sure you carry yourself to that standard. And that's something that, we kind of talk to people on day one about, is building your brand. And that's every interaction you have with an employee in the office, when we have investors walking around, all of that stuff is indicative of your brand, your personal brand.
Well, I love it. Well, Lucas, thank you so much for hopping on the SDR Chronicles today and providing some fantastic insight on diversity, humility, hiring, everything across the board that everyone wants to know more about. So once again, thank you so much for calling on the show. And as I always say, guys, keep dialing, and I'll see you guys soon.